Sometimes life takes everything from you before you discover what you're truly capable of. Sometimes the deepest connections are found in the most unexpected places. Lady Elenora thought her story was over when her village sent her to the vampire's fortress as an offering. The ancient lord, Armand, gave her one simple choice: survive until dawn and leave, or stay and face whatever comes. Most women ran, but Elenora had already buried her husband and lost her children. She had nothing left to fear and nowhere else to go, so she stayed. She talked to the monster who lived alone in the shadows. She listened to his pain and saw his loneliness. Night after night, she remained. What started as survival became something neither of them expected. But can a mortal woman truly find love with an immortal creature? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver band on Elenora's finger caught the dying light as she walked through the village square one last time. 23 years she had worn Thomas's ring, through seasons of plenty and years of loss, through the birth of their children and the terrible silence that followed their deaths. Now the metal felt cold against her weathered skin, a reminder of the woman she had been before grief carved away everything soft and hopeful. Blackmere village had always lived in the shadow of the ancient forest, where twisted oaks grew so thick that daylight never touched the forest floor. The villagers knew the old stories, tales of creatures that moved between the trees, of lights that led travelers astray, and of the fortress that stood at the forest's heart like a stone sentinel keeping watch over secrets too dark to name. But stories were one thing. Sending one of their own into that darkness was another entirely. Elenora paused beside the well where she had drawn water every morning for decades. The rope was frayed now, much like everything else in the village. The plague had taken more than lives, it had stolen their spirit, their hope, their ability to see beyond mere survival. When the council met 3 nights ago to discuss their desperate situation, she had known before they spoke her name that she would be the one chosen. She has no family left to mourn her, Elder Matthias had said, his voice carrying across the common hall. No children to provide for, no husband to protect. And the lord of the fortress, he prefers women past their childbearing years. It's a mercy, really. A mercy. Elenora had almost laughed at the word, as if being expendable was somehow a kindness. She remembered the day Thomas brought her to Blackmere as his bride. She had been 19 then, with ribbons in her hair and dreams of the life they would build together. He had carried her over the threshold of their small cottage, both of them laughing at his theatrical, the display of strength. She could still see his face in the lamplight, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he touched her cheek and promised they would grow old together, surrounded by grandchildren. The children came first. Margaret with her father's easy laugh, then young William who could make friends with any creature he met, and finally little Sarah who spoke in whispers but saw everything with wise, knowing eyes. Their cottage had been full of noise and warmth, the kind of chaos that comes from a life lived fully and with purpose. Then came the fever. It started with the merchants who travelled the trade roads, bringing exotic goods and unseen diseases. Within a fortnight, half the village was burning with fever. Within a month, the graveyard held more residents than the village itself. Elenora had nursed her family with desperate determination, brewing every remedy she knew, praying to gods who seemed to have turned their faces away from Blackmere. But love was not enough to hold back death, and one by one she watched the lights go out in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Thomas went last, his hand in hers as the fever finally claimed him. He had tried to speak at the end, but his voice was gone. She had pressed her forehead to his and whispered that she would find him again someday, when her own time came. She had believed it, then believed that death would reunite them, that the pain would end. That was 3 years ago. The pain had not ended, but it had changed. The sharp, cutting grief had worn smooth like a stone in a river, becoming something she could carry without bleeding. She had learned to live with the weight of it, to find small purposes in tending her garden and helping other widows manage their daily struggles. But purpose was not the same as hope, and hope was not the same as truly being alive. Now, the village council was sending her to the vampire lord who lived in the fortress beyond the haunted trees. The arrangement was older than anyone's memory, a pact written in blood and fear, signed when Blackmere was nothing more than a collection of huts clustered around a crossroads. Every 7 years, they sent an offering. A woman to spend one night in the vampire's keep. If she survived until dawn, she was free to leave. Most did survive, though they returned, changed, some mad, some silent, all of them somehow diminished. The women chosen were always the expendable ones. Widows without family, spinsters too old for marriage, daughters whose fathers had too many mouths to feed. Elenora understood the logic, even if she despised the cruelty of it. The vampire demanded the tribute, and the village complied because his protection kept worse things at bay. The roads stayed safe, the crops grew well enough, and the real monsters that lurked in the deep forest kept their distance. Brother Aldrich approached her as she stood by the well, his robes rustling against the cobblestones. The face was kind but tired, aged beyond his years, by the weight of offering comfort to people who had lost too much to be easily comforted. "Lady Elenora," he said softly, "I've come to offer you final prayers before your journey." She studied his face in the gathering twilight. "Do you think prayers matter to creatures of the night, brother?" "I think they matter to you," he replied. "And perhaps that's enough." She nodded, appreciating his honesty. Too many people in the village had offered her empty reassurances, meaningless platitudes about God's plan and the nobility of sacrifice. Brother Aldrich simply offered what he could, his presence, his blessing, and his refusal to pretend that what was happening to her was anything other than what it was. "Will you pray for my family as well?" she asked. "I fear I may see them again sooner than I planned." "They are already at peace," he said. "But I will pray that you find yours as well, whatever form it may take." The sun was nearly gone now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Soon the village guards would come to escort her to the forest's edge, and she would walk the ancient path that led to the vampire's domain. She had packed nothing. The council had told her it was unnecessary. Either she would return by dawn and have no need of belongings, or she would not return at all. As she walked back to her cottage for the last time, Elenora felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. For 3 years she had moved through the motions of living without truly being alive. She had tended her grief like a garden, nurturing it with careful attention. But perhaps it was time to tend something else. The guards were young men who had known her children, who remembered her as the woman who always had sweets for little ones and bandages for scraped knees. They walked beside her with respectful silence as they made their way to the forest path, their torches casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones that marked the beginning of the vampire's territory. "Lady Elenora," one of them said, as they reached the place where they could go no further, "may fortune smile upon you." She touched his cheek gently, the way she used to touch her children when they were frightened. "Thank you, child. Take care of each other while I'm gone." Then she walked into the forest alone, following the path that countless women had taken before her. The trees closed around her like the walls of a cathedral, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the stars disappeared. The only sound was her footsteps on the moss-covered stones and the distant whisper of wind through leaves. She was not afraid. Death had already taken everything from her that mattered. What was one vampire compared to the loss she had already survived? If he killed her, she would finally be reunited with Thomas and the children. If he let her live until dawn, she would return to a village that saw her as expendable and continue the half-life she had been living since the fever took her world away. But as she walked deeper into the forest, Elenora found herself wondering if there might be a third possibility, something between death and the empty existence she had left behind. The thought surprised her with its audacity, but she let it grow as she followed the ancient path toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. The fortress materialized from the darkness like something born from a fever dream. Massive stones, blackened by centuries of weather and shadow, rose from the forest floor in defiance of both time and nature. Twisted iron gates stood open as if in invitation, though Elenora suspected they had not moved from that position in decades. Vines had claimed much of the outer walls, their leaves rustling with a sound like whispered secrets. She paused at the threshold, not from fear but from a strange sense of recognition. The place felt familiar in the way that dreams sometimes do, not because she had seen it before, but because it matched something deep in her imagination. The courtyard beyond the gates was overgrown with wild roses that bloomed impossibly in the perpetual twilight of the forest. Their perfume was almost overwhelming, sweet and heady, with an undertone of something darker. Her footsteps echoed on the ancient stones as she crossed the courtyard toward the main entrance. The massive wooden doors were carved with symbols she did not recognize, though they seemed to shift and change when she was not looking directly at them. One door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. "You may enter," came a voice from within, cultured and precise but carrying an edge of weariness that spoke of centuries rather than years. "Though I confess myself puzzled, most offerings stand at the gates and weep before they find the courage to cross the threshold." Elenora stepped inside and found herself in a vast hall lit by hundreds of candles. The flames danced without any discernible breeze, casting shadows that moved with lives of their own. Tapestries hung from the walls, their rich colors unfaded despite their obvious age. At the far end of the hall, a figure sat in what might once have been a throne, but now looked more like a chair of contemplation. Armand rose as she approached, and she saw that the stories had not done him justice. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but there was something in his dark eyes that spoke of profound isolation. His face was ageless in the way that only the truly old could achieve, neither young nor elderly, but suspended somewhere beyond the reach of mortal time. He wore simple clothing, black wool and linen that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. "I am Armand," he said, inclining his head slightly, "lord of this fortress, protector of these lands, and apparently your host for the evening. You may call me Lord Armand, or simply Lord, as you prefer." "I am Lady Elenora of Blackmere," she replied, offering a small curtsy. "Though I suspect you know that already." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or amusement. "Indeed, though I must say, Lady Elenora, you are not what I was expecting." "Because I am old?" she asked, with a directness that surprised them both. He studied her for a long moment, his head tilted slightly, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Because you are unafraid," he said finally. "In 6 centuries of receiving offerings from your village, I have never had one walk into my hall as if she were arriving for a dinner invitation." "Should I be afraid?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Most are," he admitted. "They spend their night here cowering in corners or weeping by the windows, counting the hours until dawn releases them from their obligation. Some attempt to hide, as if I could not find them in my own keep. Others try to run, though the forest has its own dangers for those who wander its paths alone in darkness." Elenora looked around the great hall, taking in the faded grandeur and the careful maintenance that spoke of someone who still cared for beautiful things despite his isolation. "This is your home," she said. "It seems wrong to fear someone in their own home, especially when they have offered hospitality." Armand stared at her with the expression of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. "Hospitality," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "When did you last eat, Lady Elenora?" "Yesterday morning," she replied. "The villagers thought it best if I fasted before coming here." "Of course they did," he said with a bitterness that spoke of long familiarity with human cruelty. "Come, I cannot eat with you, but I can see that you are fed." He led her through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their movement. Some were clearly from centuries past, men and women in clothing styles that had long since fallen from fashion. But there was one portrait, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain, that made Elenora pause. It showed a young man with Armand's features, but softer somehow, unmarked by the weight of immortal years. He wore the clothing of nobility from perhaps 3 centuries past, and his eyes held warmth that the current Armands lacked. There was something heartbreakingly vulnerable about the painted face, as if the artist had captured not just the man's appearance, but his capacity for joy. "You were young once," she said softly. Armand had stopped when she did, and now he stood very still. "I was human once," he corrected. "Youth and mortality were lost to me in the same night. Do you miss it, being human?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Every day, for 600 years. They continued to the kitchens, where he prepared a simple meal with movements that spoke of long practice. As she ate, he sat across from her at a wooden table that showed the wear of centuries. She found herself studying his hands, elegant and long-fingered, but steady as stone. No tremor, no unconscious gesture, nothing that spoke of mortal nervousness or habit. "Why do they send you women?" she asked. "Between bites of bread and cheese, what do you gain from these visits?" Again, that pause that spoke of surprise. "You are remarkably direct, Lady Elenora." "I am too old for games," she replied. "If I am to die tonight, I would like to understand why." "You are not going to die," he said with quiet certainty. "I have not killed an offering in more than 2 centuries. The arrangement with your village serves other purposes." "Such as?" He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the forest that surrounded his domain. "Reminder," he said finally, "of what I was, of what I lost, of why I must remain here, containing what should not be released upon the world." "You're not a monster," she said with sudden conviction. He turned to face her, and for the first time since her arrival, his carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "You know nothing of what I am." "I know loneliness when I see it," she replied. "I have lived with it for 3 years. It changes a person, but it doesn't make them monstrous. It just makes them—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Careful, guarded, afraid to hope for connection." Armand stared at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You should fear me," he said. But there was no threat in his words, only a kind of desperate confusion. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're a vampire? Because you have power over life and death?" "I've already faced death, Lord Armand. It took my husband and my children and left me with nothing but grief and the need to continue existing. If you killed me tonight, you would be doing me a kindness. And if I don't," she considered this, "then perhaps we could talk. It has been a long time since I had a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to offer me comfort I don't need or work I don't want. You seem like someone who might understand what it means to live with loss." Dawn was still hours away, but something fundamental had already shifted in the fortress. Armand found himself doing something he had not done in centuries. He sat back down at the table across from a mortal woman who looked at him, not with fear or awe, but with something far more dangerous. Understanding. "Tell me about your husband," he said quietly. And Elenora, who had not spoken Thomas's name aloud since his funeral, found herself talking about the man she had loved and lost. As she spoke, she watched Armand's face in the candlelight and saw something there that the portraits in the hallway had captured, but which she had thought lost forever, a flicker of the human man he had once been. For the first time since entering the forest, Elenora began to understand why she had not been afraid. This was not where she came to die. This was where she came to remember what it felt like to be alive. Dawn had come and gone without fanfare, marked only by a subtle shift in the quality of light that filtered through the ancient windows. Elenora had watched it arrive from the library where Armand had left her after their long conversation, expecting to feel some sense of triumph or relief at having survived the night. Instead, she felt only a quiet curiosity about what came next. The library itself was a marvel that spoke of centuries of careful collection. Books filled every available space, not just on shelves, but stacked on tables, windowsills, and even the floor in some places. The volumes ranged from ancient texts bound in leather that had grown soft with age to newer acquisitions that suggested Armand still actively sought knowledge from the outside world. Many were written in languages she did not recognize, their scripts flowing across pages like frozen music. At the center of it all sat a single candle that cast steady light, despite having burned throughout the night without diminishing. The flame danced with its own strange life, neither flickering nor wavering, as if it existed outside the normal laws that governed fire. Something about it drew her attention, not its impossibility, but its steadiness. In a world where everything seemed temporary and fragile, here was something that endured. "You did not leave." Armand's voice came from the doorway, carrying a note of wonder that suggested her presence still surprised him. He moved into the room with that peculiar grace she was beginning to recognize, fluid and precise, as if he had learned to economize every movement over the centuries. "No," she said simply, not looking up from the book she had been attempting to read. It was written in what might have been Latin, though the words seemed to shift slightly when she was not focusing directly on them. "Should I have?" "Every other offering has departed at first light," he said, settling into a chair across from her, usually with great haste and considerable relief. "I am not every other offering," she replied, glancing up at him with a small smile. "Besides, where would I go? Back to a village that sent me here believing I would not return? Back to a cottage that holds nothing but memories of people who are gone?" She saw something change in his expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look less like an ancient predator and more like a man who understood the weight of loss. "You could go anywhere," he said quietly. "You are free now, free of the village's expectations, free of the obligation that brought you here. You could travel to the great cities, see the world beyond these forests. Could I?" she asked, with genuine curiosity. "A woman alone, past her prime, with no family and no coin. The world is not kind to people. Like me, Lord Armand. At least here, I am welcome. Are you?" The question seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. She considered this carefully, looking around the library that had already begun to feel like a sanctuary. "You have not asked me to leave. You have not threatened me or tried to frighten me away. You shared your table and your conversation, and now you have given me access to more books than I could read in several lifetimes. If this is not welcome, then I have misunderstood the nature of hospitality." Armand rose and moved to one of the windows, gazing out at the forest that surrounded his domain. "I am not accustomed to company," he said. "For centuries, my contact with others has been limited to brief, terrifying encounters. I am not certain I remember how to be a proper host." "Then we are well matched," Elenora said, closing the book and giving him her full attention. "I am not certain I remember how to be a proper guest. We shall have to learn together." Something in her words seemed to catch him off guard. He turned from the window to study her face with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable if she had not seen the genuine confusion behind it. "Why? Why?" he asked. "Why would you want to learn? Why stay in this place of shadows and secrets when you could walk in sunlight?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Elenora set down her book and walked to where he stood by the window. Outside, the forest stretched in all directions, ancient and wild, and beautiful in its way. She could see paths winding between the trees, not just the one she had taken to reach the fortress, but others that led deeper into the woods, toward mysteries she could only imagine. "Do you see that path there?" she asked, pointing to a trail barely visible between the massive oaks. "The one that curves toward the north?" "Yes," he said, moving closer to follow her gaze. She was aware of his nearness, not threatening, but different. He radiated. A coolness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the fundamental change that had separated him from mortality. 3 years ago, I would have been terrified to even look at it, she said, not because of any real danger, but because it represented the unknown. I was content with my familiar sorrows, my predictable days, my safe little cottage, where nothing could surprise me, because nothing could matter enough to cause new pain. She turned to face him, and was struck again by how young he looked, despite the ancient weariness in his eyes. "But you cannot grieve forever without eventually grieving for your own lost life. I realized yesterday, walking through that forest, that I had been dead for 3 years, not literally, but in every way that mattered. I was breathing and moving and performing the basic functions of existence, but I was not living. And you think staying here will change that?" "I think," she said carefully, "that for the first time, since my family died, I feel curious about what tomorrow might bring. That is not nothing, Lord Armand. For someone who has spent 3 years wishing she could simply stop existing, curiosity is a small miracle." Armand was quiet for a long time, studying her face as if trying to read some truth written there. Finally he spoke. "There are things about this place, about me, that you do not understand. Dangers that—" "Are there strange sounds in the night?" she interrupted. He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Strange sounds? I heard them last night. Not frightening sounds, exactly, but unusual. Like voices speaking in languages I do not know, or footsteps in rooms that should be empty. Are there others here besides yourself?" For the first time since she had met him, Armand looked genuinely uncomfortable. "There are presences, echoes of things that have passed through this place over the centuries. Most mortals find them disturbing, but not dangerous? Not if you do not seek them out," he said carefully. Elenora nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Then I shall endeavor not to seek them out. Was there anything else I should know to be a considerate guest?" The look he gave her was so incredulous that she almost laughed. Here was a man, a creature who had clearly spent centuries believing himself to be feared and avoided by all mortals, faced with a woman who treated supernatural mysteries as minor points of household etiquette. "You are," he said slowly, "unlike anyone I have ever encountered." "I should hope so," she replied with a smile. "After 53 years of life, it would be disappointing to discover I was entirely ordinary." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the library, not the mysterious voices she had mentioned, but something more immediate. A door closing somewhere in the depths of the fortress, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on stone. Armand tensed immediately, his entire demeanor shifting from confused host to alert guardian. "You should go to your room," he said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "Do I have a room?" she asked, with interest rather than fear. "You do now," he said, already moving toward the door. "The blue chamber on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. Stay there until I come for you." As he disappeared into the corridor, Elenora looked once more at the candle that burned without diminishing. Something told her that, like that steady flame, she had found a place where she might finally stop merely surviving and remember what it meant to truly live. The blue chamber proved to be a sanctuary of faded elegance that spoke of careful attention despite years of disuse. Heavy curtains in midnight blue velvet-framed windows that looked out over the forest canopy, while a fire crackled warmly in the hearth despite no visible source of wood or tending. The bed was made with linens that smelled of lavender and rosemary, herbs that reminded Elenora achingly of her own garden back in Blackmere. But it was the small object sitting on the bedside table that truly caught her attention. A music box, delicately crafted from what appeared to be silver and mother of pearl, sat open to reveal a tiny ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. The figure was exquisite in its detail, impossibly small features painted with such precision that she seemed more alive than many living people Elenora had known. She wound the mechanism carefully, and a melody began to play, something sweet and melancholy that seemed to carry the weight of memory in every note. The ballerina turned slowly, her arms raised in eternal grace, her painted face serene despite the sadness of the music. "She belonged to my sister." Elenora turned to find Armand standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but no longer tense with whatever danger had called him away. He moved into the room with that fluid grace she was, beginning to recognize, his attention fixed on the dancing figure. "Was she a dancer?" Elenora asked softly. "She was many things," he replied, settling into the chair beside the window. "Dancer, scholar, artist, diplomat." Isabel believed that a life should be lived fully, with as many experiences as possible. She used to say that God gave us hearts and minds and bodies to use, not to preserve like pressed flowers in a book. She sounds wise. She was. His voice carried a weight of loss that resonated deeply with Eleonora's own grief. "She was also the reason I became what I am." The music box continued its gentle melody as Elenora sat on the edge of the bed, giving him her full attention. Something in his posture suggested that this was a story he had not told in centuries, if ever. "There was a plague," he said, staring out at the forest, "not unlike the one that took your family, but older, stranger. It did not simply kill it, transformed its victims into creatures of shadow and hunger. The king's physicians were helpless against it. The church declared it God's judgment. Entire cities fell silent in a matter of weeks. And your sister fell ill on the same day our parents did." His hands, folded in his lap, showed the slightest tremor, the first sign of anything other than perfect control she had seen from him. "I was the eldest, the heir. It should have been my responsibility to lead our people to safety. Instead, I made a bargain with something that should have remained undisturbed." The ballerina continued her endless dance as Armand's words hung in the air. Elenora found herself thinking of her own desperate prayers during the plague that took her family, the bargains she would have made with any power that offered hope. "What did you trade?" she asked. "My mortality, my humanity, my soul, according to some interpretations." He turned from the window to meet her eyes. "In exchange, the plague stopped. My people lived. My sister recovered and lived a full, happy life. She married, had children, grew old, surrounded by love and laughter. And you became the monster that protects these lands from worse monsters." He said it with matter-of-fact acceptance, but Elenora heard the pain beneath his words. "I have spent 6 centuries containing the darkness I invited in to save my family. It was a fair trade." "Was it?" she asked, surprising him with her directness. 600 years of isolation, of being feared and avoided, of believing yourself to be monstrous, does that truly seem fair for saving your people from plague?" "They lived," he said simply. "So have you," she pointed out. "Differently than they did, but you have lived. You have this beautiful fortress, books that span centuries, knowledge and experiences that no mortal could accumulate. You have protected countless people from dangers they never even knew existed. That is not the life of a monster." Armand stared at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have a remarkable way of reframing tragedy as triumph." "I have had 3 years to practice," she said with a rueful smile. "Loss teaches you that meaning is something we create, not something we find. Your sacrifice saved your people and turned you into their protector. My loss taught me that love does not end with death, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to continue existing when existence feels impossible." The music box wound down, the melody slowing until the ballerina stopped her dance. In the silence that followed, Elenora became aware of the sounds of the fortress around them, the settling of ancient stones, the whisper of wind through corridors, and something else, Voices, distant and indistinct, speaking in languages she did not recognize. "The presences you mentioned," she said, "they are growing stronger." "They respond to change," Armand replied, rising to close the music box gently. "For centuries, this place has been stable in its solitude. Your presence has unsettled things. Should I leave?" "No," he said with surprising firmness. "That is not what I meant. They are not dangerous, merely curious. They remember when this fortress was filled with life and laughter. Your presence reminds them of what was." As if summoned by his words, the sound of laughter drifted through the walls, not threatening or ghostly, but warm and joyful, like an echo of better times. Elenora found herself smiling at the sound. "They approve of me?" "It would seem so." Armand moved toward the door, then paused. "There is something else you should know. Riders have been seen on the roads leading to the forest, men armed and traveling with purpose. Hunters, perhaps, or worse, those who seek to claim what I protect." His jaw tightened slightly. "Your village may have told them of your visit here. Some interpret the ancient pacts as signs of treasure or dark power worth claiming. The implications settled over Elenora like a chill. Will they come here? Eventually. Such men always do." He studied her face carefully. "This is why I offer you the chance to leave. Once they arrive, the situation will become complex. More complex than a widow befriending a vampire." Despite everything, he almost smiled at that. "Point taken. But these men will not be interested in conversation and philosophical debate. They will come with silver weapons and religious fury, seeking to destroy what they do not understand. Then we shall have to help them understand," Elenora said calmly. "Or failing that, help them find more pressing engagements elsewhere." Armand stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something kindle in his ancient eyes that might have been hope. I did not survive 3 years of grief and a night with a vampire, only to be intimidated by men with more weapons than wisdom," she said firmly. "Besides, someone must be here to ensure you do not forget your humanity in whatever is coming." As he left her to rest, Elenora wound the music box again and listened to the ballerina's eternal dance. Outside, the forest whispered with secrets and dangers, but inside the fortress, something new was beginning to bloom, something that felt remarkably like home. The moonstone amulet caught the candlelight as Armand placed it carefully around Eleonora's neck, the silver chain cool against her skin. The stone itself seemed to pulse with its own inner light, shifting from deep blue to silver to something that transcended earthly colors entirely. Ancient runes were carved around its circumference, their meaning lost to mortal understanding, but their purpose clear protection. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his fingers brushing against her neck as he adjusted the chain. The touch was brief, respectful, but it sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with magic. "It will warn you if supernatural dangers approach, and tell you from influences that might complicate your mortality." They stood in the fortress's main hall, where she had spent the morning learning the layout of passages and chambers that formed Armand's domain. What had begun as practical knowledge, where to find food, how to tend the ever-burning fires, which doors led to areas best avoided, had gradually become something deeper. She was not simply visiting anymore. She was beginning to understand how the fortress lived and breathed, how its ancient rhythms had sustained Armand through centuries of solitude. "You think I need protection?" she asked, touching the stone gently. It was warm beneath her fingers, as if it had absorbed sunlight despite the perpetual twilight of the forest. "I think you take risks that would terrify women half your age," he replied, though there was no criticism in his voice. "This morning I found you attempting to communicate with the spirits in the West Wing, and yesterday you insisted on exploring the cellars, despite my warnings about the creatures that shelter there." "The spirits seemed lonely," she said matter-of-factly. "And the creatures in the cellars are hardly threatening. They reminded me of the barn cats we kept when I was young. Large, mysterious, and primarily interested in being left alone unless food was involved. Armand stared at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, part bewilderment, part admiration, and something else she could not quite identify. Most mortals find this place unsettling at best. Most mortals have not spent 3 years learning to find comfort in strange silences, she replied. Your fortress is unusual, certainly, but it is not unkind. The spirits whisper warnings rather than threats. The shadow creatures avoid the living areas out of courtesy, not malice. Even the ever-burning fires adjust their warmth to the needs of those nearby. This is not a place of horror. It is a place that has been loved, and that remembers how to love in return. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a softening around his eyes that made him look almost mortal. You see things differently than I do. Perhaps because I am not burdened by guilt over what I had to become to save others, she said gently. You have spent 6 centuries believing yourself to be a monster, but monsters do not tend libraries or maintain gardens or ensure that their guests feel welcome and safe. Monsters do not sacrifice themselves to save their people from plague. A sound from the courtyard interrupted their conversation, the unmistakable clatter of horses and the jingle of mail that spoke of armed riders. Armand moved to the window with fluid speed, his entire bearing shifting from contemplative host to alert guardian. How many? Elenora asked, joining him at the window. 6, he said, his voice tight with controlled tension. Well armed, well mounted. They carry symbols. I recognize a religious order that considers itself dedicated to purifying the world of supernatural influences. Below in the courtyard, the riders had dismounted and were examining the wild roses that grew in impossible profusion around the fortress walls. Their leader, a man with graying hair and the bearing of a seasoned warrior, gestured toward the main doors, while his companions checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. They mean to enter by force, Armand said quietly. Will you let them? He turned to study her face, clearly surprised by her calm tone. They come seeking to destroy me, Elenora. This is not a matter for negotiation. Is it not? She asked, moving toward the main doors. They have not attacked yet. Perhaps they can be reasoned with. Elenora, no! His voice carried absolute command, but she had already reached the heavy wooden doors and was beginning to lift the massive bar that secured them. These men do not seek conversation. Then we must give them something they did not. Expect to find, she said, pulling the doors open before he could stop her. The leader of the group had been reaching for the iron ring that served as a door knocker when the doors swung wide to reveal not a cowering monster or an empty hall, but a woman of middle years, wearing a moonstone amulet and an expression of polite curiosity. Good afternoon, gentlemen, Elenora said with the same tone she might have used to greet visitors to her cottage in Blackmere. I am Lady Elenora. How may we assist you? The men exchanged glances, clearly thrown off balance by her presence and manner. Their leader recovered first, though his hand remained near his sword hilt. My lady, he said with careful courtesy. I am Sir Marcus of the Order of the Silver Dawn. We have come seeking an ancient evil that is said to dwell in this place. Are you a prisoner here? A prisoner? Elenora seemed to consider this possibility with genuine interest. No, I would say not. Lord Armand has been most gracious in his hospitality. Would you care to meet him? I believe you may have misjudged the situation here. Behind her, she could sense Armand's tension like a tangible force. She knew he could end this confrontation in seconds if he chose. These mortal men, however skilled, would be no match for his supernatural abilities. But violence would only confirm their beliefs and bring more hunters to his door. Lord Armand, Sir Marcus repeated, his voice carefully neutral. The master of this fortress, she said, stepping aside to reveal Armand standing in the hall behind her. To his credit, he had composed himself into an attitude of wary politeness rather than predatory threat. Perhaps you would join us for refreshment? The road through the forest can be taxing, and I find that most misunderstandings can be resolved over a proper meal. The knights stood frozen in the doorway, clearly prepared for battle, but utterly unprepared for afternoon tea with a polite widow and a vampire who looked more like a nobleman than a creature of nightmare. Their weapons remained sheathed, but their confusion was palpable. "My lady," Sir Marcus said slowly, "do you understand what manner of creature you defend?" "I understand that he is a man who has sacrificed much to protect others," she replied firmly, "and that you are men who have travelled far, based on stories that may bear little resemblance to truth. Surely wisdom suggests that we should all sit down and discuss the matter like civilized people?" The moonstone at her throat pulsed with soft light as she spoke, and she felt its protective warmth surrounding not just her, but somehow extending to encompass Armand as well. For the first time since his transformation, he was not facing mortal enemies alone. The realization seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "Will you come in?" she asked the knights with gentle persistence. "Or must we continue this conversation in the courtyard like strangers?" The blood chalice sat untouched on the table between them, its ornate silver surface reflecting the candlelight like a mirror of accusation. Armand's hands remained carefully folded in his lap as he spoke to the assembled knights, but Elenora could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally flicked to the goblet, as if it represented everything he despised about his nature. Sir Marcus and his men had accepted her invitation with the wariness of soldiers entering uncertain territory, but they had come inside. Now they sat around the great table in the fortress's dining hall, their weapons within reach but not drawn, listening as Armand explained the true history of his transformation and the darkness he contained. "The plague you speak of," Sir Marcus said slowly, "we have records of such a thing. The 13th century pestilence that consumed half of Europe before vanishing as suddenly as it appeared." "It did not vanish," Armand replied, his voice carefully controlled. "It was bound, contained within these lands by bonds that require constant vigilance to maintain. The creature I became was designed not to spread darkness, but to hold it prisoner." "And the tribute from the villages?" asked one of the younger knights, his hand resting nervously on his sword hilt. "The women sent to appease you?" Elenora saw Armand's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was the part of his existence that shamed him most. She realized not the transformation itself, but the fear it generated in others. "A misunderstanding that became tradition," he said. "The villages believed offerings were necessary to ensure my protection. I allowed them to continue because it served as a reminder of what I had lost. Each woman who came here and left safely was proof that I had not become the monster I feared." "Until now," Sir Marcus observed, his gaze shifting to Elenora. "Until now," Armand agreed, and something in his voice made her heart skip, unexpectedly. "Lady Elenora has chosen to remain, not as tribute or prisoner, but as room." He paused, struggling with words to define something that had no precedent in his centuries of existence. "As a friend," Elenora said quietly, surprised by how inadequate the word felt. What had grown between them over the past weeks felt larger than friendship, more complex than companionship, but she did not have language for something that bridged the gap between mortal and immortal. One of the knights leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "My lady, you cannot truly believe that a creature of darkness is capable of friendship. Whatever influence he may have over your mind, he has no influence over my mind beyond that which comes from intelligent conversation and mutual respect." Elenora said firmly, her hand moving unconsciously to the moonstone at her throat. "I came here prepared to die, gentlemen. I had lost everything that mattered to me and saw no reason to continue existing. Lord Armand could have killed me that first night, or let me wander into the forest to meet whatever fate awaited me there. Instead, he offered me shelter, companionship, and something I had not felt in 3 years, a sense of purpose." She rose from her chair and moved to where the blood chalice sat, lifting it carefully in her hands. The metal was surprisingly warm, and she could feel the weight of its significance, not just in the precious metal and intricate craftsmanship, but in what it represented to the man who refused to use it. "Do you know what this is?" she asked the knights. "A feeding vessel," Sir Marcus said with obvious distaste. "A symbol of self-denial," she corrected, setting the chalice down again. "Lord Armand has not used this cup in decades. He feeds only when necessity demands it, and then only from willing sources who understand the exchange. He could have taken my blood by force that first night indeed. His nature would have driven a lesser being to do exactly that. Instead, he offered me bread and cheese and conversation." Armand was staring at her with an expression of profound shock, as if he could not believe she understood the significance of his abstinence. The chalice represented everything vampiric about his nature: the need to take life to sustain his own existence, the reduction of mortals to sources of sustenance rather than individuals worthy of respect. By refusing to use it, he rejected that aspect of his transformation as completely as his supernatural nature would allow. "You speak of willing sources," the youngest knight said, his voice tight with suspicion. "What mortal would willingly? Someone who understands that survival sometimes requires compromise," Elenora said simply. "Someone who recognizes that a small sacrifice from one can prevent great suffering for many." "Lord Armand has protected these lands for 6 centuries, Sir Marcus. In all that time, how many villages have fallen to the darkness he contains? How many innocents have lived and died in peace because of his vigilance?" She could see the conflict in their faces, the ingrained revulsion for anything supernatural warring with the logic of her words. These were not evil men, she realized, but devoted ones. They genuinely believed they served a righteous cause, which made them both more dangerous and more reachable than simple fanatics would have been. "Even if what you say is true," Sir Marcus said carefully, "the Church teaches that no good can come from consorting with creatures of darkness. The risk of corruption. The Church also teaches that redemption is possible for any soul that seeks it," Armand said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "I do not claim to be redeemed, Sir Marcus, but I do claim to have served a purpose greater than my own desires. For 6 centuries. If that is not worthy of at least consideration, then what hope exists for any of us?" The hall fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the ancient stones and the distant sound of the forest settling into evening. The knights exchanged glances, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything they had believed about the nature of good and evil. "There are others coming," Sir Marcus said finally. "Word has spread of Lady Eleonora's disappearance and presumed death. The Church has declared this a matter requiring intervention. We are merely the first of several groups that will seek this place." "How many others?" Armand asked. "Dozens, perhaps hundreds, if the stories continue to grow." Sir Marcus met his eyes directly. "They will not come seeking conversation, Lord Armand. They will come with holy fire and blessed silver, intent on purging what they see as an abomination." Elenora felt the moonstone at her throat pulse with warmth as Armand's control wavered slightly. For just a moment, she glimpsed the predator that lurked beneath his careful civility, ancient, powerful, and capable of terrible violence when threatened. "Then we must give them reason to reconsider," she said calmly, her hand finding Armand's across the table. His fingers were cold beneath hers, but steady. "Or failing that, we must be prepared to defend what we have built here." The blood chalice caught the candlelight as she spoke, its surface reflecting not accusation now, but possibility, the chance that even the darkest aspects of existence could be transformed into something purposeful, something worthy of protection. The phoenix feather quill trembled in Eleonora's hand as words began to appear on the parchment before her, written in an elegant script that seemed to flow from the golden nib of its own accord. She had found the quill in Armand's private study while searching for maps that might show the approaching routes of the Church forces, but when she touched it to paper, It began to write truths that no mortal hand could have known. Asterisk. The Covenant of Blackmere Village, established in the year of our Lord, 1243. Between the people of the settlement and their rightful lord, Armand de Montclair, Knight of the Realm, and Protector of the Eastern Marches. Asterisk. The words stopped her breath. She stared at the script as it continued to flow across the page, revealing secrets that recontextualized everything she thought she understood about Armand's relationship with her village. Asterisk. Let it be known that Lord Armand, in great sacrifice for his people, has accepted transformation to contain the shadow plague that threatens all life in these lands. In return for his protection and eternal vigilance, the village of Blackmere pledges to send representatives who will remind him of his humanity, that he may not lose himself to the darkness he contains. Asterisk. Elenora? Armand's voice came from the doorway, carrying a note of concern. I felt you using the truth quill. What have you? He stopped mid-sentence as he saw the parchment in her hands, his face going pale with something that looked like panic. You were their lord, she said quietly, not looking up from the still-flowing script. Not their monster, not some ancient evil that demanded tribute. You were the nobleman who ruled Blackmere, who protected them, who loved them enough to sacrifice your humanity for their survival. Elenora, please. The women they sent were not offerings to appease a demon, she continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. They were reminders, volunteers who came to help you remember what you were fighting to protect. They came to keep you human. The quill continued writing, revealing details that painted an entirely different picture of the arrangement between vampire and village. The women who came were not chosen for being expendable, they were chosen for being strong, wise, capable of seeing past surface fears to deeper truths. They came with stories of the village, news of births and deaths and marriages and harvests. They came to anchor Armand to the world he protected. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, finally looking up to meet his eyes. Armand stood in the doorway like a man facing judgment, his hands clenched at his sides. Because the truth makes it worse, he said quietly. Do you not see? For 6 centuries I have allowed my people to fear me. I have let them believe they were sending sacrifices to a monster rather than, his voice broke slightly, rather than help to a friend who was drowning in isolation. They knew, Elenora said, understanding flooding through her as she read more of the covenant. Look here, the representatives shall be chosen for wisdom and courage, that they might serve as beacons of humanity in the darkness that surrounds our protector. They always knew, Armand. The stories of tribute and sacrifice those were told to outsiders to protect both you and the village from those who would not understand. She rose from the desk, the parchment still in her hands, and moved toward him. He backed away slightly, as if afraid of her reaction to these revelations. My village has been lying to itself for generations, she said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind. The council members who remember the true covenant have died out, replaced by those who believed the fearful stories. They forgot that they were sending help to their protector and began to believe they were appeasing a demon. Which is why they sent you, Armand said bitterly. A widow, they thought, expendable rather than a woman chosen for her strength and wisdom. But I was chosen correctly, wasn't I? She asked, stepping closer to him. Not by the current council, but by what? Fate, the covenant itself, the magic that binds this place? The moonstone at her throat pulsed with warm light, as if responding to her words. I came here broken and hopeless, ready to die. But I was exactly what you needed, someone who had nothing left to lose, who could see past fear to the man beneath the legend. The truth quill in her hands grew warm, and when she looked down, new words were appearing on the parchment. Asterisk, the shadow plague stirs in its bonds. The seals that contain it weaken as the protector's isolation deepens. Only through connection to humanity can the guardian maintain the strength necessary to preserve the binding. Love anchors light in darkness. Hope transforms duty into purpose. Asterisk, the plague, she whispered, understanding hitting her like a physical blow. It's not just contained, it's fighting to break free. And your isolation, your belief that you're a monster rather than a protector, it's been weakening the bonds that hold it prisoner. Armand's composure finally cracked completely. He sank into a chair near the window, his head in his hands. Every year I felt it growing stronger. Every year the binding required more effort to maintain. I thought it was the natural consequence of time, the inevitable failure of magic against an ancient evil. I never considered that my own despair might be feeding it. Because you forgot what you were fighting for, Elenora said gently, moving to kneel beside his chair. You remembered your duty but forgot your purpose. You protected the village but lost connection to its people. You became exactly what the Shadow Plague wanted you to become. Isolated, despairing, disconnected from the humanity that gave your sacrifice meaning. She reached out to touch his face, lifting his head so she could meet his eyes. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. And for the first time in centuries, you're not alone. The quill in her other hand grew almost hot as more words appeared. Asterisk, the Guardian's bond with the mortal woman strengthens the ancient seals. Her presence here was not accident but necessity. The Shadow Plague must not be allowed to break free when the church forces arrive. Their holy fire and blessed silver, applied ignorantly, could shatter bindings they do not understand. Asterisk, the approaching knights, Armand said with dawning horror. They think they're coming to destroy a monster, but if they damage the containment spells, the plague will be released into the world again, Elenora finished. All your sacrifice, all your centuries of vigilance, undone by men who believe themselves righteous. She stood, the parchment still clutched in her hand, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. How many people live in the surrounding kingdoms now? How many cities? How many innocents who have no idea what supernatural forces have been protecting them? Millions, he said quietly. The population has grown enormously since the 13th century. If the Shadow Plague spreads again with modern travel routes, modern cities, he didn't need to finish the thought. Then we have to stop them, she said simply. Not just the knights who are coming, but all of them. We have to make them understand what they're truly threatening. How? He asked. They see only a vampire and his supposed victim. They will not listen to explanations about ancient magic and contained plagues. Elenora looked down at the truth quill, which had begun writing again. Asterisk. The covenant can be renewed. The original binding can be strengthened. But it requires willing sacrifice from both guardian and anchor. The price is the guardian's immortality and the anchor's mortality. Both must choose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair. Asterisk. She stared at the words, understanding their implication. The magic that had transformed Armand could be altered, redirected, shared. Instead of one immortal guardian growing ever more isolated, there could be two mortal protectors working together, their combined humanity strengthening the bonds that held the Shadow Plague prisoner. There's a way, she said slowly, showing him the parchment. But it would mean giving up your immortality, becoming mortal again. But together we could... No, he said immediately, rising from his chair. I will not ask you to sacrifice your natural lifespan for my mistakes. You're not asking, she said firmly. I'm offering. And before you refuse again, consider this: what good is a natural lifespan to someone who has already lost everything that made life worth living? What good is mortality to someone who has been merely existing rather than truly living? The truth quill grew warm in her hands one final time. Asterisk. Love transforms all sacrifices into gifts, freely given. Asterisk. Outside, the forest whispered with approaching danger, but inside the study, two people who had found each other across impossible circumstances began to plan not just how to save the world, but how to save themselves. The Guardian's sword lay across Armand's knees like a bridge between his past and present, its blade catching the firelight with an inner radiance that spoke of blessings older than kingdoms. The weapon was beautiful in its simplicity, no ornate decoration or precious gems, just perfect steel that had been consecrated by faith and tempered by sacrifice. It was the sword he had carried as a mortal knight, the one he had drawn in defense of his people countless times before his transformation. Now it would serve that purpose one final time. "The church forces will arrive at dawn," Sir Marcus reported, his voice heavy with the weight of divided loyalties. The knight had spent the past 3 days wrestling with revelations that challenged everything he believed about the nature of good and evil. Cardinal Toretti leads them personally. He brings 50 blessed warriors and 3 battle priests trained in the destruction of supernatural entities. Elenora felt Armand's tension like a living thing as he tested the sword's balance. His movements were fluid and precise, muscle memory from his mortal days, combining with supernatural grace in a way that was both beautiful and terrible to watch. She understood now why he had been chosen for transformation, not just because he was willing to sacrifice himself, but because he possessed the skills necessary to be an effective guardian. Cardinal Toretti, Armand repeated thoughtfully. I remember that name. His grandfather was among those I saved during the original plague outbreak. The irony is considerable. There is still time to flee, Sir Marcus said quietly. My men and I could delay them, give you enough time to escape into the deep forest, and abandon the binding that contains the shadow plague. Elenora shook her head firmly. That would doom millions of innocents to the same fate that befell Europe 6 centuries ago. We cannot, will not, allow that to happen. She moved to the window, where the pre-dawn darkness was beginning to soften into grey. In the distance, she could see pinpricks of light moving through the forest torches carried by men who believed themselves on a holy mission. They would arrive within the hour, and when they did, everything would change. The renewal ritual, she said, turning back to face Armand. Are you certain it will work? He set the sword aside and took her hands in his touch cool but steady. The magic is older than my transformation, older than the church itself. It draws on the fundamental forces that bind light and darkness, love and fear, hope and despair. If we are truly willing to sacrifice everything for each other and for the greater good, then yes, it will work. And if we are not, then the binding will shatter completely when the Cardinal's blessed weapons strike it, and we will face something far worse than death. His grip on her hands tightened slightly. Elenora, there is still time to reconsider. What I am asking of you, what you are offering, it cannot be undone. You would give up your mortal span to become something between human and immortal, bound to this place and its guardian magic for whatever years remain to us both. She studied his face in the firelight, memorizing the features that had become as dear to her as Thomas's had once been. But this was different from the love she had shared with her husband, deeper, more complex, born from understanding rather than circumstance. With Thomas she had loved a man she grew up with, built a life with, shared familiar dreams with. With Armand, she loved someone who challenged her to become more than she had ever imagined possible. Do you know what I have learned in these weeks with you? She asked softly. I have learned that love is not diminished by loss, it is refined by it. I loved Thomas with the passion of youth, with dreams of a future that seemed guaranteed. But I love you with the wisdom of someone who has already lost everything and found something worth living for again. The church will see it as corruption, he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. They will believe I have ensorcelled you, stolen your soul. The church will see what they choose to see, she interrupted. But those who matter, those who truly understand love and sacrifice, they will see two people who chose each other across impossible circumstances. They will see hope triumphing over despair, connection conquering isolation. Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew stronger. Sir Marcus and his men had taken positions at the windows, ready to fight alongside the vampire they had come to destroy, if it meant protecting innocent lives from an even greater threat. The transformation in their attitudes spoke to something fundamental about human nature that gave Elenora hope. When faced with truth, most people could overcome even the deepest prejudices. The ritual requires a catalyst, Armand said, rising to retrieve an ancient tome from the shelf beside the fireplace. Something that represents the bond between us, the choice we are making together. Elenora touched the moonstone at her throat, feeling its warm pulse against her skin. Your mother's amulet? Among other things. He opened the book to a page covered in script that seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. Your wedding ring, as a symbol of love that endures beyond death. The truth quill, representing our commitment to honesty with each other. The music box that played for my sister, representing the family we hope to become. She nodded, understanding. These objects had become touchstones of their relationship, anchors that grounded their impossible love in concrete reality. And the sword? The instrument of our transformation and the symbol of our united purpose. He lifted the blade again, and it seemed to sing softly in the air, its steel reflecting not just firelight, but something deeper, the inner radiance of consecrated purpose. When the Cardinal's forces arrive, they will see a vampire threatening a mortal woman. We must show them something else entirely, which is a knight defending his lady, and a lady standing with her chosen protector. His smile was sad and beautiful and full of hope. We must remind them that love transforms even the darkest magic into something worthy of protection. The sound of horns echoed through the forest, the church forces announcing their arrival with ceremonial fanfare. Through the windows, Elenora could see banners bearing holy symbols, armor gleaming in the growing dawn light, weapons blessed for the destruction of supernatural evil. "Are you ready?" Armand asked, offering her his hand. She took it without hesitation, feeling the familiar cool touch that no longer seemed alien but simply different. "I have been ready since the night I chose to stay instead of fleeing at dawn. I have been ready since I realized that sometimes the greatest courage is not dying for something you believe in, but living for someone you love." They made their way to the great hall where the renewal ritual would take place. Sir Marcus and his men followed, their own weapons drawn not to threaten but to protect. The ancient magic that permeated the fortress seemed to respond to their united purpose, the very stones humming with power that had been dormant for centuries. At the center of the hall, Armand began to arrange the objects that would serve as catalysts for their transformation: the moonstone amulet, Eleonora's wedding ring, the truth quill, his sister's music box, the guardian's sword he placed last, its blade pointing toward the main doors where their enemies would soon appear. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that these weeks with you have been the most human I have felt since my transformation. You have given me back not just hope, but the memory of what it means to truly live rather than merely exist. And you have given me a reason to live again after I thought such reasons were impossible," she replied, taking her place beside him as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the courtyard. The doors of the fortress stood open, revealing the dawn sky and the armed forces of the church arrayed in battle formation. Cardinal Toretti himself rode at their head, his robes gleaming with protective symbols, his face set with the certainty of the righteously determined. But as he looked into the hall and saw not a cowering victim and her supernatural captor, but a man and woman standing together in obvious partnership, his expression shifted from certainty to confusion. "In the name of the Holy Church," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of divine mandate, "we have come to purge this place of evil and free any mortals held in supernatural thrall." "Your Grace," Elenora called back, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them, "you are welcome in our home. But I fear you have been misinformed about the nature of what you seek to destroy." As the first rays of true sunlight streamed through the open doors, the Guardian's sword began to glow with inner fire, and the ancient magic that had protected the land for 6 centuries stirred to new life. The heart's compass spun wildly on the table between them, its silver needle pointing first toward Elenora, then toward Armand, then trembling between them as if unable to decide which direction represented the greatest desire. Cardinal Toretti stared at the mystical device with growing confusion, his certainty shaken by what should have been impossible, a moral compass showing that both the supposed monster and his alleged victim shared the same deepest longing. "This cannot be," he whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward the blessed silver at his belt. "The device is corrupted by supernatural influence. No mortal soul could truly desire." His words were cut short as the fortress itself began to respond to the growing tension. The ancient stones hummed with power, and somewhere in the depths below, something stirred that had not moved in centuries. The shadow plague, sensing weakness in its bonds, pressed against the magical barriers that contained it. "Your Grace," Armand said quietly, his hand resting on the Guardian's sword, "you must listen carefully. The weapons your men carry, the holy fire you have brought, they will not destroy me. They will destroy the binding that keeps something infinitely worse imprisoned beneath this fortress." "Lies," Cardinal Toretti declared, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The heart's compass continued its strange dance, and other objects in the hall began to respond to the supernatural tension. Candles flared brighter, shadows deepened, and the very air seemed to thicken with approaching danger. One of the battle priests stepped forward, his blessed weapon gleaming with silver fire. "Your Grace, perhaps we should simply complete our mission. The vampire's words are surely designed to confuse and delay us." "No," Elenora said firmly, moving to stand between the priest and Armand. The moonstone at her throat blazed with protective light, and for a moment she seemed to glow with inner radiance that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with absolute determination. "You will not harm him. Not while I draw breath." The priest's weapon wavered as he stared at her. "My lady, you are clearly under supernatural influence. No mortal woman would willingly protect. A mortal woman would protect the man she loves," she replied simply. "A mortal woman would stand between danger and someone who has sacrificed everything to protect others. A mortal woman would choose love over fear, even when that choice seems impossible." The heart's compass stopped spinning abruptly, its needle pointing directly toward the space between Armand and Elenora. In the sudden stillness, everyone in the hall could hear what lay beneath their words, truth so profound it resonated in the very stones around them. But the moment of revelation was shattered by a sound from below that made every person present freeze in terror. Something vast and ancient was moving in the depths of the fortress, pressing against bonds that had contained it for 6 centuries. The shadow plague had found the weakness it sought not in the magical binding itself, but in the doubt and conflict that weakened the Guardian's connection to his purpose. "It comes," Armand said, his voice carrying 600 years of weary determination. "Your presence here, the conflict you bring, it feeds the darkness below. We must complete the renewal ritual now, before the floor beneath their feet began to crack, black tendrils of something that was not quite shadow and not quite substance seeping through the ancient stones. Where the darkness touched, the very air seemed to sicken, and several of the church warriors staggered backward in instinctive revulsion. "What is that?" Cardinal Toretti demanded, his face pale with dawning understanding. "The reason your ancestor lived to father your bloodline," Armand replied grimly, drawing the guardian's sword in one fluid motion. The blade sang with holy light that pushed back the creeping shadows, but Elenora could see the strain in his face. The binding had been weakened by centuries of isolation, and the darkness below was stronger than it had ever been. She moved to his side without hesitation, placing her hand over his on the sword's hilt. The moment their skin touched, the weapon's light blazed brighter, and the shadows recoiled with a sound like screaming wind. "Together," she said simply. The heart's compass began to spin again, but now its movements were purposeful, pointing toward the cracks in the floor where darkness seeped through. As if responding to some signal only it could perceive, the device began to glow with the same light that emanated from the guardian's sword. "The binding requires love," Elenora called out to the assembled warriors, her voice carrying clearly over the rising sound of something massive, stirring, below. Not just duty, not just sacrifice, but genuine connection between guardian and anchor. "That is what you threaten with your blessed weapons and holy fire, not just Lord Armand's existence, but the love that keeps this darkness contained." Cardinal Toretti stared at the growing cracks in the floor, at the sword that blazed with combined light when held by both mortal and immortal hands, at the heart's compass that showed impossible truth with unshakable certainty. His certainty crumbled as understanding dawned. "We are not here to destroy a monster," he said slowly. "We are here to witness a miracle." But even as the words left his lips, the floor gave way completely, and something rose from the depths that made the assembled warriors cry out in terror, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that had grown strong, feeding on isolation and despair for 6 centuries. The true battle was about to begin. The unity crystal materialized in the space between Armand and Eleonora's. Joined hands, born from their combined will and desperate love, it pulsed with pure white light that cut through the writhing darkness emerging from below like a beacon of hope in an endless night. The stone was perfectly clear, yet somehow contained depths that seemed to reflect both their souls, his ancient wisdom tempered by her mortal courage, her human warmth strengthened by his immortal dedication. The shadow plague recoiled from the crystal's radiance with a sound like dying wind, its form revealing itself fully for the first time in centuries. It was vast and terrible, a writhing mass of hunger and despair that had fed on isolation and grown strong in the darkness beneath the fortress. Where it touched the ancient stones, they cracked and blackened, and the very air around it seemed to sicken with malevolence. "The renewal ritual," Armand called out over the creature's screaming, his voice strained with the effort of holding the guardian's sword steady against the darkness. "It must be completed now, before the binding fails entirely." Elenora felt the power flowing between them through their joined hands, his immortal strength and her mortal determination combining into something greater than either could achieve alone. The unity crystal grew brighter as their connection deepened, its light pushing back the shadows that sought to engulf the hall. "I choose you," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every person in the fortress. "Not because I am compelled or ensorcelled, but because I have found in you everything I thought lost forever. Love, purpose, hope, and the courage to fight for something greater than myself." "And I choose you," Armand replied, his ancient features transformed by emotions he had thought himself incapable of feeling. "Not as tribute or offering, but as partner and equal. You have reminded me that redemption is possible, that love can transform even the darkest magic into something worthy of protection." The unity crystal blazed like a captured star as their vows resonated through the fortress. The shadow plague shrieked and writhed, its form beginning to compress as the renewed binding took hold. But it was not going quietly. Tendrils of darkness lashed out toward the assembled warriors, seeking to corrupt or destroy anything that opposed its escape. Cardinal Toretti stepped forward, his own blessed weapons now glowing with sympathetic light. "Men of the Church," he called out with renewed conviction, "we stand not against love, but beside it. These two souls have shown us that the greatest miracles come from the union of sacrifice and devotion." The battle priests joined their power to the growing radiance, their holy weapons adding their light to the crystal's glow. Sir Marcus and his knights formed a protective circle around the ritual, their steel singing as it cut through the reaching tendrils of shadow. But the shadow plague was desperate now, and desperation made it cunning. Instead of fighting the light directly, it began to whisper words of doubt and fear that sought to break the connection between Armand and Elenora. Asterisk, "She will age and die while you remain immortal." Asterisk, it hissed with voices like autumn leaves. Asterisk, "You will watch her grow old, watch her suffer, watch her fade until only memory remains. Is that love, or is that cruelty?" Asterisk. Elenora felt Armand's grip falter slightly as the words struck home. The unity crystal flickered, its light wavering as doubt crept into their bond. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the creature's whispers. "We choose mortality together. We choose to live whatever years remain to us as equals, as partners, as two people who found each other across impossible circumstances. Whatever time we have, 10 years, 50 years, it will be enough because it will be shared." The crystal blazed brighter than ever as her words banished his doubt. Around them, the fortress itself seemed to respond to their renewed determination, ancient protections awakening that had slumbered since Armand's original transformation. Asterisk. "Then you will both die." Asterisk. The shadow plague snarled, gathering itself for one final assault. Asterisk. "And when you are gone, nothing will remain to contain me. I will spread across the world like wildfire, and millions will fall to feed my hunger." Asterisk. "There will be others," Elenora said with quiet certainty. "Others who choose love over fear, connection over isolation. The binding we create today will not require immortal guardians, but mortal ones who understand that some things are worth any sacrifice." She looked toward Cardinal Toretti, who nodded with understanding. "The Church will remember this day," he said solemnly. "We will ensure that guardians are trained and prepared to maintain what you establish here." The shadow plague made one last desperate lunge toward freedom, but it was too late. The unity crystal's light had become a burning star that filled the entire hall, and the Duke, renewed binding, snapped into place with the sound of cosmic thunder. The creature's scream of defeat echoed through dimensions as it was pulled back into the depths, the cracks in the floor sealing behind it with sigils of protection that glowed like molten silver. As the light faded, Armand and Elenora stood transformed, no longer immortal and mortal, but something between. Two souls bound by choice rather than magic, their love having created something stronger than either immortality or mortality alone. The unity crystal settled gently into Eleonora's palm, its work complete, but its light eternal proof that some bonds transcend the boundaries between human and divine. The eternal rose bloomed in the garden where no flower had grown for 3 centuries, its petals shifting through every shade of red, from deep crimson to pale pink as the seasons changed around it. Unlike the wild roses that had always grown in the fortress courtyard, this single bloom had appeared the morning after the shadow plague's defeat, and it showed no signs of ever fading. Its roots grew deep into soil that had been blessed by sacrifice, watered by tears both bitter and sweet, and nourished by love that had transformed the very essence of the place. Elenora knelt beside it in the early morning light, tending the small garden she had planted around the miraculous flower. Her hair was streaked with silver now, after 5 years of mortal life with Armand, but her eyes held a contentment that had been absent during her years of grief. Her hands, no longer soft from a life of leisure but calloused from honest work, moved with practiced efficiency among the herbs and vegetables that now fed both them and the steady stream of visitors who came seeking their wisdom. "The delegation from the Northern Kingdom arrives today," Armand called from the kitchen window, his voice carrying the warmth of domestic routine. He, too, showed the gentle signs of mortality lines around his eyes that spoke, of laughter shared, hands that bore small scars from learning to work wood and stone without supernatural strength. The transformation had gifted them both with normal human lifespans, though longer than most, allowing them perhaps 40 years together if they were fortunate. "I know," she replied, settling back on her heels to admire the garden's progress. Brother Aldrich sent word ahead. They seek guidance on establishing their own guardian protocols. In the years since Cardinal Toretti had returned to Rome with his remarkable testimony, the Church had quietly begun training select individuals in the arts of supernatural protection, not to destroy creatures of darkness, but to understand and guide them toward purposes that served the greater good. The fortress had become an unlikely center of learning, where priests and scholars came to study the delicate balance between human and supernatural forces. Armand emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of bread and tea, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate mortality after centuries of immortal grace. He had adapted to his new limitations with characteristic determination, finding joy in simple pleasures that immortality had made impossible, the satisfaction of a day's honest labor, the sweetness of sleep earned through weariness, the precious quality of time that was no longer infinite. "Sir Marcus sends his regards," he said, settling beside her on the stone bench they had placed near the eternal rose. "His youngest daughter has been accepted into the Church's guardian training program. She has her father's courage," Elenora observed with a smile, "and her mother's wisdom. She will do well." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the forest that was no longer haunted, but merely wild. The twisted paths that had once led travelers astray now guided them safely to the fortress, while the creatures that dwelt in the deeper woods had become protectors rather than threats. The transformation had rippled outward from their renewed binding, touching everything within the ancient borders with purpose instead of fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Armand asked quietly, a question he posed perhaps once each season, as if still unable to believe his good fortune. "Which part?" she replied with gentle humor. "Staying that first night instead of running, choosing you over safety, giving up my mortality to share yours? All of it. Any of it." She considered his question seriously, as she always did. "I regret the years I spent merely existing after Thomas died, believing that grief was the only honest response to loss. I regret that the village forgot the truth of their covenant with you, allowing fear to replace understanding. I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of long partnership. "But I regret nothing that led to this moment, this life, this chance to love and be loved in return." The sound of horses in the courtyard announced the arrival of their visitors, diplomats and scholars who would spend the next week learning how supernatural guardianship could be. Adapted to their own lands and needs, Elenora and Armand had become reluctant experts in the field, their success inspiring others to seek similar arrangements with the otherworldly forces that touched the mortal realm. "Ready?" he asked, rising and offering her his arm with courtly grace that 6 centuries had not dimmed. "Always," she replied, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they walked toward the fortress to greet their guests, the eternal rose caught the morning light and seemed to glow with inner fire. Visitors often asked about the flower's significance, and Elenora always gave the same answer. It bloomed eternal because it was rooted in choices freely made, nourished by love that asked nothing but gave everything, and protected by 2 people who had learned that the greatest magic was simply choosing each other, day after day, for whatever time they were given. Behind them, the fortress stood strong and welcoming, its ancient stones warm with life and purpose. The shadows that had once whispered of isolation now murmured of companionship. The corridors that had echoed with loneliness now rang with conversation and laughter. They had built something here that neither had imagined possible, not just a home, but a sanctuary where love had transformed duty into joy, sacrifice into gift, and two broken souls into something whole and purposeful. The eternal rose continued to bloom, marking the spot where a widow who had lost everything met a monster who had forgotten his humanity, and both discovered that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with the simple decision to stay instead of running away. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest magic of all, not the power to change the world, but the courage to let the world change you, and to trust that love would make the transformation worthwhile.